What's up, sons? It's Blind Rod with Tech once again, and as promised, I did get the RX 574 GB and the GTX 1063 GB to put them head to head in Monster Hunter World. Now, earlier, before I got my hands on the RX 574 GB, which came a little bit after the game came out because I was actually at DreamHack for that, I tested it on the Ryzen 5 2400G. And I was surprised. It actually ran reasonably well at 1080p with, some, of course, resolution scaling in there, but it was, maintaining 30 to 40 FPS and on without a lot of variance there. We weren't having bad 1% mins or 0.1% mins, and everything seemed super smooth. So I was like, well, that's interesting. We definitely have to follow through with the test, because if you guys didn't check out my video on the $700 build for Monster Hunter World, you should do that right now. And when you do, you'll see that I suggested picking up what? An AMD GPU? Yes, I did. Now, why is this? Why would that be? Why would I already assume that AMD was going to perform better? Well, pretty simply here, it's Capcom, and if you've looked at any of the games they've released in the past 2 years, they've just performed better on AMD. So it was a pretty safe bet. We have proof now for you guys right after this. Welcome back. So starting things off, let's talk about the test bench. It's an ASRock Z370 SLI AC, and you can check out a review for it on this channel somewhere. Maybe I'll link it up here. It's paired with an i3 8350K, which is the 8000 series, meaning it's basically the 7000 series i5. It's a true quad core, and it's overclocked to 4.8 gigahertz. While I do have it delidded and can hit 5 gigahertz on it pretty easily, even on air, if you don't delid it and you get a bad sample, 4.8 is what I would call reasonable that you can maintain on it. So that's why we're at that. The memory is 16 gigabytes of Corsair Dominator Platinum, clocked at 3200 megahertz, and it is not Samsung, it's definitely Micron, but it's still pretty decent memory. We also have 256 gigabyte SSD. However, we put it on the hard drive, which is just a 7200 RPM hard drive by Seagate, and that's what the game files are stored on. And that's just because it's going to be typical for that price range to be coming off a hard drive. If we noticed problems, then we would have moved it over to the SSD. Now, a lot of people have noticed that this game is very CPU intensive. However, it was kind of interesting while I was running it, and you can see it on my live streams, which if you guys want to pick apart every single testing point, you can always go check out my live streams, and if you have the wherewithal to go through 2 hours of it. But I do it for transparency, so you guys know where we're at, essentially. And you'll notice that even on the 8350K, while it is high percentage CPU usage, we're never throttling the GPU. What's even more interesting is that it's spread evenly across all CPUs, or all cores, essentially. And I found that super intriguing because I was under the impression from early reviewers and such that it was optimized poorly for CPUs, but this appears to be the opposite of that. It seems to be optimized quite well because it's spreading across that workload. My next test that I want to do after this, and hit the sub if you're interested in it, is we also have a Ryzen 1600, which is around the same price range of the 8350K, and so we're going to put those head to head and see which one wins with the best GPU that we have tested here. So we have basically the XFX RX 574 gigabytes, and it's the XXX edition, overclocked to 1328 megahertz on the boost. So that's what we're running at. And then on the GTX 1063 gigabyte, it's the MSI Aero, and that one's currently overclocked to about 2025. So they're both overclocked. However, you'll see here that you probably wouldn't need it on either one. There's a big issue going on with Nvidia that you can't really see right off the bat, and I'll point it out to you guys. But what we used to benchmark was a tool called OCAT. It's OCAT, and the great thing about OCAT is it's open source and on GitHub, number one. Number two is it captures every single frame and calculates the time between each frame, so you can get more in-depth performance benchmarks off of it. And then we basically got to the point of having the first open world setting where you get into the camp and you Basically, we did a run around of kind of faking the first mission once we unlocked the expedition mode, and then made sure we were at daytime because nighttime actually performs quite a bit better in Monster Hunter World. So this would be what I would call worst case scenario. This is right around not the high up, which would be like noon or anything when the sun's way up there, but probably more like sunrise, and that appears to be the most demanding portion of the game, or time of day for the game, as it casts a lot of shadows that are like kind of long shadows. And then we played the game at 1080p medium settings. Now the reason we went with medium settings is because we wanted to give both cards a fair chance, and going above medium settings increases the VRAM past 2.5 gigabytes or past 3 gigabytes, which is all that the GTX 1063 gigabyte has. So another interesting point here is you actually have more room to play with settings on the RX 574 gigabytes as you start capping out that above medium settings. So you're gonna get above 3 gigabytes of VRAM essentially, but we wanted to give them both a fair chance, so that's what we went with. Now, all of that out of the way, here is the benchmark chart. As you can see, the GTX 1063 gigabyte had a 59 FPS average, which is pretty respectable, with a 41 FPS min. However, that doesn't quite tell the whole story, and you'll see why when we get to the next portion of these benchmarks. Now, the RX 474 gigabyte performed a little bit better on the average with 63 FPS, but absolutely just blew the GTX 1063 gigabyte out of the water with its 1% mins of 53. That's pretty much a 20% increase on the 1% mins, which, if you guys understand anything about those benchmarks, is going to be a very much more important average here, and we're going to show you a visual example. So the first chart here is going to be the RX 574 gigabyte. Now this is going to be the time between frames. So each dot on this chart represents a frame, and basically the vertical line is going to be the time between frames in milliseconds. So if you were going to calculate this out to FPS, you would basically say 1000 divided by the time between frames, and that would give you the frame per second. So you do 1000 divided by 16.67 to be exact, would be 60 FPS. So you're wanting to look right around that kind of 16 millisecond mark. And if you're there and you're staying very close knit, then you have what I would consider a well-performing game. And this chart is actually a perfect example of a very well optimized running game on the RX 574 gigabyte. And you can see all of them are really tight with only a couple outliers that are not even 0.1% mins. They're only like probably 0.001% mins, and you can clearly see them. Now, hopping on, and this is where you'll understand where the performance kind of complaints start to come from. Here's the GTX 1063 gigabyte. Keeping in mind that we didn't go above the 3 gigabytes of VRAM in any of the settings, and that we weren't being bottlenecked by the CPU whatsoever, you'll notice a huge difference in the time between frames chart, and these dots are all over the place. This is basically a telltale sign that the game is not optimized for that hardware. And this has actually been a trend across, like I said, most Capcom games. Most recently that I've tested personally, which you can check out up here, is going to be Resident Evil 7. Even though Resident Evil 7 supports Nvidia and is a way it's meant to be played game, even as that from Capcom comes out performing much better on its AMD competitor cards. So I'm not talking about like high end, because that's something we would have to test a little bit differently now that we have RX 64, if I can get one that runs right, which I'm working on. So we're going to leave that out. But if you're talking about the $200 price range, as far as I can tell you right now, go with AMD. Even if you're going to go up to, you know, the RX 588 gigabyte and the GTX 1066 gigabytes, I can pretty much guarantee at this point, without even testing, because I don't have one in right now. I don't have the 1066 gigabyte. That's what I'm working on getting in. Even if I don't, or even though I don't, I can pretty much tell you that, you know, if you're looking to play Monster Hunter World and you're going to get an RX 580 or below, or a GTX 1060 or below, to go ahead and pick up the red team's version. Now I know that might make some of you green team fans salty, but you guys get new graphics cards soon, so it essentially always comes down to picking out the best graphics card in your budget for the game you play the most. And if you play Monster Hunter World the most, or Resident Evil 7 the most, or Forza the most, those are the recent titles that I can recall for favoring AMD, then you're going to want to pick up an AMD GPU. However, if you're playing something completely different all the time, like Batman Arkham Origins for example, then you're going to want to go green team. Basically, try to figure out what game you're playing the most of, and then pick what GPU performs best in that game for your scenario and your price range. That's about all it comes down to for me. I personally am playing Resident Evil 7 right now, and I've swapped in the 570 4GB to do that playthrough, and then when I had Batman was doing that playthrough, I swapped in a GTX. Now I understand that not everybody has that ability, so you know, you might want to pick one that covers the most amount of games, and in a lot of terms, of course, that is green team. I've ranted on enough. I just want you guys to have as many tools as possible for you to pick the best GPU for your system, and we'll continue to try to provide that here on this channel. And I'd love to see your comments down in the comment section below. Check out the live streams if you want to pick apart all of my testing, because that'd be great. And I will see you next Tuesday.